We have three women here who have, if you're from outside of California, maybe you're not as familiar with them as we are inside California. But we have women who have had experiences and been in the major players and events and with personalities that have certainly made it to the national stage. On the end, we have Delaine Eastin, who served 2 terms as California Superintendent of Public Instruction from '95 to 2003. She was the first and only woman ever to hold that position, so I'd like to talk a little bit about the first woman as phenomenon in this as well. She served 8 years before that in the California State Assembly and chaired the Assembly Education Committee. She also served 6 years in the City Council in Union City, California, and after leaving public office, she joined the faculty at Mills, so she's actually been on both sides of that divide. And she currently serves as the Distinguished Visiting Professor of Educational Leadership there, and she holds degrees from UC Davis and UC Santa Barbara. Next to her, we have Loretta Lynch, who was a member of the Public Utilities Commission here in California in 2000 and 2005. That might not sound as controversial and astounding as it actually turns out to have been during the crisis that we had here in California, largely Enron-driven, but I'm sure we can hear about that from her. She was president of the commission from 2000 through 2002, and prior to her appointment to the PUC, she was the director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research under Governor Gray Davis. Before entering public service, she was a partner in the firm of Keeker and Van Nest, where she represented corporate clients and individuals from the technology and industrial sectors. And she's worked in roles for political candidates including Bill Clinton, Gray Davis, Dianne Feinstein, Ellen Tauscher, and Delaine Eastin. And she's a graduate of the University of Southern California and also Yale University Law School. And to my left, we have Margita Thompson, who is the press secretary to probably the most masculinized governor in the country, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And she serves there as his chief spokesperson. She worked previously in the White House with the Office of the Vice President, where she was press secretary to Mrs. Cheney. She also served as the California press secretary for the Bush for President campaign in 2000, and was a political producer for the Larry King Live show on CNN that you may have heard a little bit about. She held various positions in the high-tech industry, and she has a BA degree from right here, from Cal. And a master's in public policy from the Harvard University Kennedy School. And there are a couple of claps for that one as well. And she also has a first woman notation here. She's the first woman to serve as a press secretary to a California governor. So we have quite a panel. We have a bipartisan panel. We have elective and appointed people in these positions. So we ought to have quite the experience for the after lunch session today. So if we could start with Delaine Eastin, if you could give a few comments, and then we'll move through the panel and get to questions after that.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand so that those of you in the back don't fall asleep on me, but I want to apologize to those who are not from California. I'm sure we all have a little bit of a California bias, but on the other hand, remember the little jingle, so sing my friends, be blithe, be gay, or weep my friends with sorrow. What California is today, the rest will be tomorrow. So I am the 33rd woman ever to be elected to the California legislature. I am also the first and only woman to be the state superintendent of public instruction. I was smart enough to have Mary Hughes and Cliff Staten, her partner, run most of my political campaigns, and to have Loretta Lynch as my campaign manager when I ran for state superintendent. So if you don't like what I say, just look at what I did, though. I had smart people around me. Let me just say to all of you that who are thinking about running, I want to just echo the comments that were made earlier about how important I really believe it is to get involved in local government first. The truth is, you can hone a lot of very important personal skills in local government. It is, because it's nonpartisan in California, it's a great place to learn to work with people of a different political persuasion. It's also a great place to learn how to do analysis and, in fact, to do the really hard lifting of politics. This is a different state. It is so much bigger than so many states that people run in. And so when you talk about, I raised $3 million to be the state superintendent of public instruction. The fellow who succeeded me raised $7 million. At the time I raised $3 million to be state superintendent, I met Jean Shaheen, who was governor of, where was she, in New Hampshire, and she told me it cost her only $2 million to run for governor. So the scale of running for California offices, somebody said running for the state senate when you're 30, good grief, the state senate is bigger than a congressional seat. So it really does serve you, I think, to start out and learn how to do, if I may say, some of the heavy lifting and the scut work of politics, which isn't as glamorous as some people would have you believe. It's also better, though, than some people would have you believe. I've worked in a lot of local campaigns, and I've worked in some state and national campaigns, and I will tell you I've met some of the finest people in my life. I've met people that you know, were senior citizens and kids who had dreadlocks and you know, gothic appearances, and they were all wonderful because they all got involved in this process. You know, the Greeks believed that, it's interesting, the Greeks believed very much that you needed to be involved in drama and in music as well as in politics. And they believed they were related, but not in the ways you're thinking. They believed that the act of personal participation, whether it was in performance, in the musical sense or drama sense, or whether it was in politics, would change you personally. So I want to tell you that you won't get rich in politics if you're honest, but you will in fact be rich in ways that many pinstripers do not understand. You will make friends of a lifetime, and you'll get to work very hard and very long hours on very important things. I will tell you that I think that the service itself is so wonderful that you will find it uplifting. But yes, it is different to serve in the legislature than to serve as head of an agency. And yes, it is different to be elected than to be appointed to a term or to be appointed to serve at someone's pleasure. The truth is, if you're appointed to a term, that means the boss can't pull you out of there and may not reappoint you, but you do get some independence out of that. So the regents of the University of California have a 12-year term. The trustees at CSU have a somewhat shorter term, but a term. And you'll find that there'll be a little more independence. The Public Utilities Commission, once confirmed, has a 4-year? Six-year term. So the truth is that having a term gives you some independence. It doesn't mean the person that appointed you won't try to jawbone you on things. When you serve at someone's pleasure, though, I mean, you may argue with them in the privacy of the back room, but if you want to pick a public fight, you ought to submit your letter of resignation that day. And that's just the honest truth. So I had a slightly different experience as a legislator, where you have a relatively small staff and you represent 1/80th of California. And although you work on important policy issues, as I mentioned yesterday, those of you who were here, the truth is that oftentimes policy concerns that you have that are extremely important may or may not come to the fore in the end because you weren't in the budget room, because you weren't in the meeting of the Big Five, where the leader of the Republican and Democratic parties in the two houses got together with a Republican or a Democratic governor, it really doesn't matter, and made some decisions. Jenny reminded me I misspoke yesterday. In fact, it was Gray Davis who was the governor when reapportionment was done last time. And I will just tell you that in that last reapportionment, women were disadvantaged. But women of both political parties, nobody gets off. They pushed out moderate Republican women, and they pushed out moderate Democratic women, and even some liberal Democratic women. But the truth was, the situation was unfortunate from where I sit. Because I do believe that women hold up half of the sky, and I do believe that countries are served, as states are served, as cities are served, as school districts are served, when women hold half of the seats. All other things being equal, I'll vote for a woman before a man. But if it's not equal, if the man is the better candidate, then you, by God, ought to support the man. That's a fact. But somehow we have to get to a place in California where we have women in leading constitutional positions. Today in California, we have not one single statewide constitutional officer. And the most we'll have after the last election is if Deborah Bowen wins Secretary of State, we'll have one. She'll be the second Secretary of State in history, March Fong Yu from Alameda County being the first. We have had a woman controller, that being Kathleen Connell. We have had a woman treasurer, that being Kathleen Brown. And we actually, Ivy Baker Priest many years ago, but she was appointed, I believe. The truth is, though, we do have 2 United States senators, but all other things being equal, it is harder. And after the reapportionment in '92, when Pete Wilson did veto the bill and it went to the court, it was much more competitive. So I have to tell you, one of my biases is I would actually like to see a commission do reapportionment. Have not these gerrymandered, weird-shaped seats, but have seats where they really are more competitive. I didn't like the governor's initiative because I didn't think it was well written. But the truth is that we have to do something about not just making sure that the old boys get together in the back room and take care of their friends. And that's hurting, I would argue, not just one party or another. It's hurting, frankly, women, and it's hurting the diverse populations that we should be inviting in to our leadership positions. I'll say something else, and that is, I do think it's hard for women to climb the ladder, but I think once they've climbed the ladder, women, in fact, are capable of doing a great job. But it's a funny thing. When I ran the Department of Education, I administered over 30% of the state budget for the state of California. I had a staff in the department of 1,600. To contrast that, Water Resources, which administered 1/2 of 1% of the state budget, had 4,800 people. 1,500 to do 31%, 4,800 to do 1/2 of 1%. In fact, there were departments that had, 19,000, 75,000, but we have kept the Department of Education relatively small, which has meant we have had to figure out ways to use county offices to do some of the work, which in other states might be done by the Department of Education, and find other ways to get our job done. When I took office, I had fewer special ed consultants than the state of Maine. You may have noticed we have a few more kids here than Maine. We have a lot of kids in special ed. And so we were getting in trouble with the federal government for not doing our job. And I had to go on bended knee to beg. By the way, this is federal money we're using. I wasn't even taking money from the state coffers. But to try to be able to do my job, I had to convince the then governors to allow me to do my job. And I had trouble with both Wilson and Gray Davis at various times for different reasons. But the truth is that at the end of my term, somebody came to me and said, "Oh yes, you run the department run by women." 60% of my top staff was female. There's no department in the state which has 60% men where somebody would say, "Oh, you run the department run by men." But the fact is, I went out and sought some really talented people who had done some really good work to endeavor to get things done for California's children. My initiatives included standards for all kids, a position that was opposed by both the Republican caucus in the Assembly and the Republican caucus in the Senate. But I want to give credit where credit is due. 3 brave Republicans crossed over on the Assembly side and helped put that bill out. And Pete Wilson signed it because he had told the business community, "I can't lobby for it because I can't take an opposed position in my caucus. But if it gets to me, I'll sign it." I proposed class size reduction, and the Governor Wilson was opposed to that. He said he had a better idea of what to do with the money, and that was a tax cut. And when we defeated the tax cut in June of that year, the governor agreed to do class size reduction, although instead of the 4-year phase-in that I'd proposed, we did it in 2 weeks. But we still got it done, and there was not $1 given for the department to administer that program. But it was a lot of hardworking people, women and men, who really, I think, felt they were on a mission at the department. I think that can happen in the administration of women and men. I don't think it's peculiar to women, and I've met women that, frankly, they're not all good. There's a whole continuum of people of both sexes running agencies, and some of them aren't very nice people. But overall and on balance, I have to tell you that I think the state of California has a big challenge ahead of it. And one of the things is to bring in more women to these positions. I want to leave you with one thought. This was in the Sacramento Bee on Monday. If we were talking about money earlier, this is the independent expenditure committees. This was on the front page of the Bee above the fold. Take a look at it. There are 26 different candidates that were supported by the independent expenditure committees. Only 4 of them were women. There were only 3 candidates that were opposed. They were all 3 women. So all other things being equal, if I had more time, I would spend more time on this issue of campaign finance. Because at the end of the day, somehow we have got to allow the voices of all people to be mutually heard. The debates, real debates about real issues, and not just expensive 30-second ads to see who's the cutest, see who is the cleverest, see who's the funkiest in terms of their ads, but instead for California to have a dialogue and a debate about issues. We're hurt by term limits. I couldn't agree with that more. But we're also hurt by a conversation which is not about issues and not about substance, but about who's got the most money to spend. Thank you all very much.
I am here to talk as an unelected administration official or former administration official about the challenges of women running a government bureaucracy or government agency as an unelected appointed person. And what I have seen is a change over the last 10, maybe 15 years, actually for a bias for women administrators in what I call the soft policymaking subjects. Education, health, children, seniors, and also the back office functions of personnel and running the government in terms of real estate, things like that. But actually, I still believe that there's a bias against women as the CEO of a government agency in what are the economic regulatory positions. Energy, telecommunications, utilities, finance, corporations, the Securities and Exchange Commissions, banking, transportation. Those areas are more traditionally seen as we need that left to men because it's technical or it's engineering related or it's money related. And I think that women who are interested in working in policymaking in economic regulatory areas really do need to have their credentials pinned on their shoulder as they move forward to be able to move ahead and to make policy. And of course, I think the environment's changing. I think it used to be that men were more in the technical area of the environment, were seen as better administrators. But now, because the environment is also seen as something that's a reform-oriented and a family and societal-oriented issue, that women also are seen as effective administrators when it comes to environmental protection. I don't know where water is in all of that, but I definitely think that in terms of pollution and other kinds of environmental protection, women really are seen as capable leaders, and their leadership is not as challenged as on the economic areas. But more than anything, I think women who go into administrative roles, especially unelected administrative roles, need to understand that administrative or executive branch policymaking is actually a political endeavor. So many women I see are so excited to have a chance to make policy, and they're so focused on the substance of what they want to do that they forget that there's more than substance to be able to actually make the policy. There's process, and there's what I call the persona, or the penumbra of who you are and how you're judged and evaluated. And all of those things are important to be able to make policy. So if you're going to be an administrative, the head of an administrative agency, which really is the CEO of a governmental bureaucracy, you need to have executive and legislative relationships, and you need to work your executive and legislative relationships. And one mistake I made, and certainly I saw other women make more than men, was to sit in their agency and do the work instead of schmooze with the legislators and the press and the lobbyists and your other executive branch colleagues, and make those relationships that when it hits the fan, the relationships give you the benefit of the doubt rather than all the hard work. And also, it shows that you're a leader. I think it's especially hard for those of us who have been on boards or commissions. If you're heading a board or commission and have real power as the chair or head of that commission, you still need to strike a collegial balance where you work with your other colleagues who are commissioners or board members, but you are responsible for running the agency and the administration of that agency. And that's a difficult balance to strike, I think, in terms of the public persona. I think it's actually an easier balance to strike one-on-one working with your colleagues. But I found often that my colleagues resented that I was going to Sacramento to work on our budget issues or our personnel issues or working with the legislature because they expected me to be doing the woman's work, which is stay here and do the substance. But if you're going to head an agency, you've got to be able to allocate your time and be very aware that you're going to be doing politics as well as policy. Because if you don't do the politics well, you are not going to be able to do the policy well. One of my male mentors in the legislature told me that the things I needed to be successful as an administrator in the executive branch was to have somebody watching my back on budget, on legal, on personnel, and the press. And if I had those 4 positions in place, then I could do the other work that I needed to do. But within a state administrative bureaucracy, it takes a long time to be able to either forge those relationships with the people who are already in those positions or get your own people into those positions. And in the case of the Public Utilities Commission in California, at the height of the energy crisis, we were creating the position of press secretary because it was such an esoteric commission before then that it wasn't seen as needing a press secretary, although the weight of the nation, certainly the weight of California's press, was on the PUC during the height of the energy crisis. So here we are working with the budget committees in the legislature to get a press secretary during the time when we needed the press secretary. Absolutely. And in terms of the persona of administrative decision-making, I think it's different for women. And I think all women who have had this experience don't want to have it, but know it, which is you will be judged on your weight, on your hair color, on your marital status, on whether you have children, and whether you can talk to a group without using girl language. Like, I think, I believe, this is my opinion, rather than just, this is how it is. And Delaine has always been a great role model for me about just, this is how it is. Let me tell you how it is. But it's astonishing. And I remember when I was working as deputy campaign manager for Dianne Feinstein when she first ran for the U.S. Senate in 1992, it was astonishing how many stories referenced her hairstyle and commented on her hairstyle as if it were a matter of public policy. Until I got into an administrative office and realized how many stories referenced essentially my weight. And during that time, during the energy crisis, I was gaining weight, as was obvious, but the reporter didn't need to point that out. And it was very difficult on a personal level to be able to deal with press stories or rumors or gossip among the politicos about personal attributes, who you're dating, who they think you're dating, what the rumor is about who you're dating, and all of that, especially as, at that point, an unmarried person, or even what your sexual orientation is. Which brings me to another aspect of a persona, and this goes for women who are elected or appointed in executive branch or the legislative branch, which is women are they're pigeonholed as either too soft, too nice, or too mean. And we know what the real word for too mean is. They're either hard and aggressive and too mean, and we could also argue strong, intelligent, assertive, and have leadership. But those aren't the words that are used for women who are leading the troops in an agency or in the legislature. Or they're too nice, or they're too pretty, or, they're really not that smart. And, their staff is great, because did you see that speech? She couldn't have written that. And I think a lot of people in this room, probably me, I'm sure myself included, have thought that about women in the legislature or in administrative positions who are just like, how could they be that good? Well, of course, that couldn't have been them. And so women are pigeonholed as either too nice as a lightweight, and so therefore you can discount them and their policies as a lightweight, or they're too mean, or they play the heavy. And we all know that means they're really a bitch. And I had that brought to me in a very personal way when, during the height of the energy crisis, the Democratic legislature in the Assembly brought oversight hearings to impeach me for incompetence because I had dared to question Enron and frankly, the entirety of deregulation as a sham and as a crime. So what do? They bring the woman head of the PUC up for oversight hearings to quiz me about the arcana of the electric system. I'm sitting there with my briefing books because I'm gone on substance. That's my policy. I've got to know every answer. When Senator Sheila Kuehl pulled me aside, took me out to dinner and said, this was the night before the first hearing, this is what you need to do, Loretta. You need to wear pearls, a really feminine suit, a lot of makeup, have your hair so that there's not one wisp out of place, and you say, yes, sir, and no, ma'am, and you smile. And I want to see you smiling through this whole thing no matter what you're talking about. And I just said, I don't think I can do that, Sheila, let me tell you. Excuse me, but energy prices are now 10 times what they should be, and we got to go after these guys. And she said, you can't go after these guys until they stop coming after you. So dig your fingernails into your palms until they bleed, if you must, but I want to see you smile through that entire hearing. And that's what I did. And later, a Republican legislator who was on that oversight committee, who I became friends with, told me that the Republicans had focus grouped those hearings because they wanted to portray the woman whose policies they didn't like as the bitch, basically, and also as someone you should not listen to, because obviously she missed question 17 on the quiz. And instead, what they found in focus groups for independent and Republican women was that they thought I was nice and pretty competent. It didn't matter that I knew what a megawatt was. It just mattered that I wasn't what the pigeonhole that they were portraying me. And so I think it's important and underscored for all women who want to be in public office or in government that your persona matters, that what you wear matters, how you present yourself matters. You need to be comfortable with your title, whatever it is, and allow people to use it. And you need to understand that at every moment people are judging you as a woman as well as a policymaker. And that for all the talk this morning and yesterday about how women have in some sense, better credentials or always building their resume, you have to remember that you need to build your persona as well. Otherwise, it will affect your policy if you don't have the persona that you need and the politics that you need to contribute to your policy. Thanks.
I am very fortunate that I am Governor Schwarzenegger's press secretary. While Governor Schwarzenegger may be the most masculinized governor that there is, he has surrounded himself with a lot of strong women. First of all, of course, which is Maria Shriver, who is a wonderful person and a positive presence in the governor's office and has very much become a mentor to me, which is a wonderful thing. But also a lot of the senior staff are women. So it's a good, positive environment in that you never feel any sort of weird dynamic that there might be in terms of the good old boy network that I have definitely felt perhaps in some of the other places that I have worked. So that's not the case, which is great. As the governor's chief spokesperson, I have to know a little about a lot. I have to be prepared to answer questions on any number of issues. After a while, the reporters understand that you have a long-term relationship, and so you get very comfortable with the I don't know answer, and they appreciate that because they'd rather have the right information than not. But at the same time, they definitely want to assert their predominance on you, and so they will definitely pepper you to try and make you feel like you're a complete idiot. I do a press briefing once a week that's similar to what happens at the White House, where you may have seen Ari and Scott McClellan and now the new press secretary doing similar briefings. And as Loretta was mentioning, the challenge is that you have to be very good, you have to be very aggressive, you have to be on the ball, but you also get the feedback that you come across as bitchy. And so it's very, very hard. It's not something that a male press secretary would get. But reporters can get very aggressive with you. And the challenge for a press person is that you cannot match them emotion for emotion. You have to stay calm. They can be rude, infuriating, lie about things, misquote things on purpose because their goal is to goad you into having an emotional reaction to something. And so when it is seen on air, when it is seen in print, you're not going to see what evoked that response. You're only going to see what the result was. So a lot of time, I'm digging my fingernails into my hands, doing the same thing, thinking internally, a lot of different words, but having to remain calm and try and convey a concerned presence, but at the same time one that is confident and also conveys a sense of confidence in the reader and the viewer. But it's very hard because the reporters want to take you on, and the press corps, by and large, is male. And so you've got an interesting dynamic there. I happen to be very fortunate, proud of it. I'm Latina as well. They also happen to be predominantly white. So it's amusing to me. A lot of times they'll try and convey sort of a politically correct attitude and try and challenge me and goad me, and it's just amusing to me as I look out on this white male bastion as they try and goad me in some random issue or another. And that's how I get my calm, because I realize the irony of it. But you have to consistently make sure that you're not going to give in to some of them, and I will say some of them I do think are misogynistic, and I do not like some of them, but how do you deal with that? I end up having the men deputies in my office deal with them, and I just don't. And it's a much better and easier rapport that way. If they call me, I'll always call them back. You always call a reporter back, but by and large, a lot of it isn't something that they need on the record. They just need the information. So you figure out a way around it. You don't necessarily address it head on, because you're not going to win. What's Mark Twain? Never get in a fight with someone who buys ink by the barrel? Not worth it. when you decide to be press secretary, or you decide to get involved in communications, and by and large probably when you decide to be involved as a principal in any sort of elected or appointed position, you need to be comfortable with being confrontational, and that sometimes is hard for women. I get in arguments every day with reporters, but what you guys probably don't think about or realize is that I get in fights every day with staff. Because it's my job to be the press person's advocate, or to be the reporter's advocate internally. But that means that I'm having to be the reporter's advocate internally, and that means changing people's priorities that they're working on the inside. They may not like the story the reporter's writing on. Half the time, the policy that the reporter's calling about is only half-baked, but we can't admit it's half-baked. So how is it that you get around that? Or maybe a decision hasn't been made. I don't want to deal with that right now. I'm working on this piece of legislation. I can't handle your answer right now. Well, in a place where you're dealing with 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, rapid, immediate news cycle, I need you to change what your priorities are. So one of the things that I do think that women do well is something that Loretta was also mentioning. You have to be a coalition builder. People think about coalitions in terms of, going to war in Iraq, or, sometimes that means going to war on the inside. Who is going to be your coalition and your advocate so that you have credibility when you are going in the inside? And also sometimes, I'm sure this could strike fear into all of your hearts, but sometimes it is policy by press. It's like, okay, you're not going to give me an answer. This is what I'm going to say. Because I pretty much know where the governor is going to go, and I have a feeling the governor will back me up, so pretty much I'm good. But it's that constant tension of how far can you go out? Do I have to protect my flank? Let's say I go out this far, and I know I'm right on the policy answer, but what's the impact going to be on the legislature? So you have to be cognizant of the fact that you've got all of these different moving parts that are going on. But it's also very hard being a woman and having that ability to be very aggressive, because then when you leave work, you kind of don't realize it, but you are the same, which has definitely impacted my dating life. Because you have these discussions, and suddenly you realize that you're having to win every single discussion that you're having, period. And then suddenly it's like, I don't care if we had red wine or white wine, fine. But so it's definitely hard, because in your private life, you do probably want to have a little bit of a different, softer persona. And so how are you going to kind of make that adjustment? I do a weekly briefing, and I would say sometimes also it impacts what are you interested in. I love policy. Pretty much I can answer you a little bit about almost any question that you could throw at me, so that I could at least pivot off of it. Even if I didn't know the answer, I could fake it. But there's one thing that I'm not interested in at all: sports. Could care less. But sports are a reality, sports are an industry, and sports are important to the state of California. So Governor Schwarzenegger goes about a month ago to Dallas. And he goes to meet with NFL Commissioner Paul Tagliabue. I am proud of the fact that I can even pronounce Paul Tagliabue or know who he is. And so I've got like 2 bullet points in my mind that I'm like, okay, it'll be fine. I have to do my briefing that morning, and I know that we want a new team. We don't want to take it from Southern California. It doesn't want to come from San Diego. We want a new team. And then I had some random legislative issue that I knew the answer to that could be my pivot point, so I could sound like I was smart and knew what I was talking about, whatever. So I look at the male press corps, starts asking me about what happened with the governor in Dallas, and I said, okay, the governor had a great meeting. He definitely and that the governor had said while he was in Dallas, I don't just want one team, I want 2 teams. I'm like, okay, adjust my talking point. We want 2 teams to come to California, because sometimes you just have to adjust to whatever the reality is of what the governor happens to say. He didn't go off to my talking points, so I have to go off of his. So they start saying, well, does he want a new team? And I said, well, yeah, he wants more teams. Well, but is that a new team or an expansion team? And I am just like, oh, God. And I said, well, if we have 5 teams, he wants 7. They're like, we have 3 teams. So, okay, well, if we have 3, he wants 5. And then they're saying, well, does he want to take it, then they said, well, does he want to take the San Diego Chargers? I know the answer to this, and I said, no, we definitely want a new team. We don't want to cannibalize any teams from California. I think cannibalize, that'll be really quotable, that'll make them, they've got their soundbite, they'll be done with me, but no. They said, well, what about the New Orleans Saints? Now, I'm not an expert in sports, but I know we want to take nothing from New Orleans. So at this point, I'm like, and so this is when you're honest, like, I don't know. Fine, I will never be on Mystic Pizza on ESPN. To which all the reporters laugh because, of course, it's cold pizza on ESPN. And they tell me Mystic Pizza is a movie that starred Julia Roberts. I'm like, oh, right. So finally, I was practically near tears, but also laughing as I was doing my briefing. And they were finally amused, and they realized that they had taunted me long enough, and thank God the torture ended. But it was the toughest briefing I've had as a press secretary. And you need to know about everything. And sometimes it's self-selection on my part. I didn't care about sports and came back and bit me. One of the stylistic things that I do think is different between men and women that I have definitely noticed is how we take credit. Women are really comfortable with we, big sharers in the credit, and men are very comfortable with I. This is what I did. And and it's a delicate balance, because to me, I say I, and I even hear men say I just think it's so arrogant. It's like, I didn't do anything. The only person that should be using I in my mind is the governor. Everyone else is just staff, all dispensable, sadly, but all dispensable. We should all be saying we, because we haven't done anything without being collaborative. Because as I mentioned, there's 20,000 different strategic things you need to worry about: strategy, policy, politics, relations. But anytime that women say we, and then you're in the same conversation and the guy next to you is saying I, naturally people are going to gravitate and think that he has more authority. If you had to you had to diffuse your impact, and he was aggregating his. And you need to just have a delicate balancing act and figure out stylistically how you want to compensate for it. But it's definitely something that I think has a subliminal impact in how women are perceived. I want to talk a little bit about the personal side of being a staff person and the impact. Your work colleagues end up becoming your family. I have two friends here, one of whom works for me now. It was totally her option to come, and one friend who I worked with before 20 years ago. And you just end up staying in contact with all of these people because you go through the war zone with folks, and it just ends up being a permanent thing. I'm giving you 1 minute. Okay, I'm going to talk really fast. You need to feel a responsibility to mentor others. I was alluded to here, women have a greater need to prove their merit of why they are where they are. That's one of the reasons why I went to the Kennedy School of Government. It's because I instantly know that I have no one will question my credentials for having been where I have gone. And then finally, what I'm just going to talk about quickly is being single and working in government. It is hard and it sucks, basically. Because what happens? You've got a dating pool where people are like, oh, well, they're intimidated by you because of everything you've done. I gotta be me. I've done fun stuff, but I'm mellow about it. And it's also, I realize this isn't the whole world. On election day, because I'm on the official staff, I wasn't involved on election day, so I viewed it a little bit like kind of the general public does, and I realized, oh my God, the world doesn't stop on election day. Everyone's not wearing their little sticker. Very weird. Sometimes you date people who want to be you, not date you. People who want access to the people that you have access to, and are kind of figuring out that they're going to hopefully move up the ladder and meet people that they want to meet because they want to date you. I definitely think power is an aphrodisiac for man, and power is a repellent for women. Sadly. And then the other thing I'll say that I think is interesting is that a lot of times people talk about balancing family and work. And it's hard for someone who's single. I definitely sympathize with mothers who have to do stuff with their kids, fathers who want to go to softball games. But I want to leave so I can date, so I can meet someone that will eventually lead to me being able to get married and have a kid. So it's a delicate balancing act, but it's really hard. I think that everyone analyzes, oh, what's the impact of work on family on someone who's married and has kids? But hi, single women suffering too. So I'm here to represent for the single women in politics. Thank you.
In the interest of moving towards more of a glass half full feel to this particular piece, it's a new goal, but worthy. I wanted to ask, we've talked a lot about the sort of good old boys network and some of the difficulties and the discouraging parts of being a woman in the political world. I'm wondering, is there a positive side to it? Are there advantages to being a woman in these executive positions? And is there any kind of a good old girls network?
I think it's developing. I certainly had friends within the governor's office and at other agencies who would, even when they were very busy, give me time. And frankly, more than my male friends. And I thought also in terms of mentoring and bringing folks up, I was very cognizant of making sure that in an agency where more of the folks who were in management were men, that if there was a qualified woman, I was going to make sure that that person had a chance as well. I mean, to the extent that my personal staff became predominantly women, and then there was the rumor that, we were the coven over in the corner because we're all women and men need not apply, even though I had men on my personal staff. But certainly I thought that there were relationships, maybe not as strong as some of the links with the men, but I guess my view about good old boys is that you're in just because you're a man. And for the good old women, you're in because you've had a forged bond or experience. And so there's already been some kind of screen of ability or loyalty or something. And so I don't see it as just every woman gets in the club, but once you've almost gone through the trial by fire, there are women in that club. So perhaps we need to be more inclusive in our club.
It's funny, I think when I first got to the legislature, there were a few of us, and I think in some ways we were closer in the sense that we, weird things were still happening. Becky Morgan wore a $1,200 designer suit onto the floor of the state Senate and was thrown off the state Senate floor. And all of the women of the Republican and Democratic parties got together and had a press conference to protest. The guys were wearing Levi's with ties. But the fact she was wearing an Armani suit, back when $1,200 was real money, here she was dressed to the nines, really, but the fact she was wearing pants, and we just all went ballistic. And so there were weird little things that were happening then that I think actually drove women together in interesting ways. But I will say I've always felt a very strong bond to women both in the legislature and the executive branch. And I do think I was mentored both by men and women, but that certainly there are women who, the lobbyists, frankly, when I first got to the legislature, there weren't that many women lobbyists. And the ones who'd been there a little bit of time were, sort of trying to take you under their wing to say, these are things you should know, and these are things to watch out for. I think we all have a responsibility, if I may say, to bring women along. I'm no longer in elected office, but I'm a founding member of the National Women's Political Caucus in this state and a local chair. I'm a former president of the California Elected Women's Association. I belong to Emily's List, Majority Council, California List. I'm really still a now member. I really believe that, again, all things being equal, you always pick the best candidate, but this state would be far better served if we had more agencies run by women, more commissions that were half women, and more women in the legislature. I have to say, I believe that the United States of America, given our background, should be moving more quickly ahead. And Mary, I agree, we've done a lot in Northern California, but we're hitting a little hiatus here, partly because of the malapportionment that occurred. But I think we have to redouble our efforts to make sure that this country, the only country on earth of a major global status that doesn't have universal preschool, the only country that isn't dealing with the health care issue for all people. I mean, there's something happening in America, and we ought to be able to figure out in a bipartisan way how to deal with some of the basic issues. The education of our children is going down. It's not being strengthened. And the universities and colleges are getting further out of reach for people. At just the time when the global economy in the information age says that everybody needs a great education. This should not be Democrats versus Republicans. It should, in fact, be about people with a vision of the fate of this republic that says because we have got to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to fully participate. And I have to say, I think up to this minute, my generation's been a little bit of a disappointment. We've moved a little bit ahead in terms of equity for women, but we haven't moved ahead on some of these key issues. And it's my sincere hope that the younger women who are here today are going to, in fact, really move into the front ranks of elected life, because, in fact, we need more people that'll say the emperor has no clothes on. And I have great hope for Gen X, because the people I meet, especially in the colleges, but throughout the state, they are people of hope and vision and courage and heart, and that's what this country needs as much as anything. And I hope that more women in this audience are really thinking seriously about, what they can do to be involved.
I would just say one thing. I think women have a competitive advantage. Women are capable of thinking outside of themselves very easily. And I think the challenge is to, when you're mentoring someone, you need to proactively think about, how can I help this person succeed? Sometimes mentoring, people think about it, but it's the mentee coming to you and asking for advice. And what I really try to do is think about, and I do this with my staff, I ask them sometimes, what is it that you want to do? And then I just have in the back of my mind, how can I help them get there? So there may be something that comes up where I think, you know what, maybe I should have Rachel in my office go to this event because she hasn't had a chance to see the governor and see how we work on the road. Or maybe I should have Gina staff an event that has to do with the National Guard because she's been doing X, Y, and Z thing and maybe wants to work in defense contracting or something. But so it really takes, I think, proactive thinking to try and see what you can do to help people, as opposed to just waiting for them to ask. And I think that on the natural, women will more easily do that than men would.
Okay, next question. There's a recent book out by a law professor by the name of Kenji Yoshino called Covering. I don't know if any of you have read it. There was a piece in the New York Times Sunday magazine on this, and basically his argument is that the civil rights movements in this country have moved us to the point where there are women in elected office, there are people of different races and ethnic backgrounds, gays and lesbians, etc. But the new challenge is for people in those positions to maintain that identity, that in fact what people in those positions have to do is to try to conform to what is considered the standard, which is a white man. So if a woman is in a position of power, then she has to dress more like a man or behave more like a man or speak in a lower tone of voice or whatever that may be, and that covering and that need for us to cover up our femininity or your difference of whatever sort is sort of the next challenge, the next thing that we're not doing yet in the civil rights struggle. Does that, some of you made comments that were sort of along those lines. Does that sort of an argument resonate with you? Do you feel that there's some sort of a sense that you can't be too feminine? It sounds like in some ways there are.
The first time Dan Walters ever talked to me, he said, do you think it's right that women in the legislature dress better than average women? It was the first thing he ever said to me. I'd been in the legislature a few months. I thought, what an odd comment. I said, women in the legislature dress like women in business dress. I think you do have to think about how you present yourself professionally. I think that would be true, though, whether you were trying to be the head of an agency or whether you were trying to be the head of a corporation. I think you have to, I have a low voice, so maybe I don't try to lower my voice. But the truth is, I think women have to think somewhat about how they present themselves. They really do. Having said that, I have known women in politics that, don't wear makeup and, typically you want to be neat and clean, but you don't necessarily, I think, need to be thinking entirely about how you dress, and you ought to spend a lot of time reading your material, being better prepared. That's where competitive advantage really comes from as far as I'm concerned. So, don't go out there in your shorts and thongs, but this thong means different thing now than it used to. But But you know what I'm getting at. You have to look like you're a professional woman, and having said that, you know, I believe that the competitive advantage really comes if you read the budget, if you read the material, if you do the preparation. I'm sure you felt maybe more comfortable smiling, because that's actually an endorphin thing when you're testifying. They had to teach me to smile in the beginning. I took all this so seriously. They beat me until I'd smile more. But the truth is, I think the real thing that women have to do is they have to be well prepared, and then you've got to practice your presentation, which is another reason to go to local government first, because you do learn how to address people. And little things, like people taught me, Mary Hughes taught me not to ever point my finger at anybody. See how aggressive that is? Much better to have the curved finger. I learned that. But at the end of the day, I still think it's more important to be the person who's really prepared than to be necessarily in the designer suit.
And I think it's a question of understanding what the expectation is so that you consciously deviate if you've decided to deviate. So you can be who you are, but or you can be yourself, but you have to understand how other people are going to perceive who you are. And just a quick story on that. I have been used to working in teams, even though I was clearly the leader of the team, but I've found that it's easier to be more collaborative, which is kind of a classic woman thing to do. And my language reflected that. So when I would be with my male staffers and say, well, let's do this, that really was a you do this. But they didn't get that. And so it wasn't getting done, and it wasn't getting done. And I finally came back to them and said, where is this? And they said, well, you said let's do this. We were waiting for you to do it. I'm like, who's the boss and who's the staff? So you have to understand, if you're going to be collaborative and say, let's do this, that some people don't understand that as an order, because they're used to, in Deborah Tannen's words, the hierarchy of male relationships versus, the relational nature of female relationships. So women are taught to collaborate, all of the school ground stuff that Deborah Tannen has looked at, and men are taught to relate to each other in hierarchy. So if you don't understand that, you can miss the boat in how people are going to respond to you. But you can certainly make the choice to be a strong woman or a soft woman, a woman with a high voice or a woman with a low voice. But you need to know how that is going to play, and you then own that persona. So my view is you can have a variety of personas, but know what your persona is and how that translates through your politics and your policy making.
That's very dog whisperer. Anyway, go ahead.
I would say what I am very focused on is who's my audience. That's where it ends up falling. I spoke yesterday or 2 days ago, to a group of fourth graders. I was a complete spaz, but the kids loved it because it was something I was down to earth, and I was hanging out with the kids, saying like a lot. And so that worked out fine. But there are other times, say when you're in a meeting, when you happen to be fortunate enough to be in the room making policy, where you need to convey a completely different persona. And you sit up a little bit straighter, you're forceful. I don't know if my voice gets deeper, but you definitely have to know your facts. You have to be confident in how you present them. And that's a little bit of the benefit of being a press secretary. I may be full of BS, but I can convey the fact that I know what the heck I'm talking about. But I think I talk about it being almost bilingual. I'm fortunate enough to be speak Spanish, English, but I'm bilingual in that I can try and adjust to the audience and what it is that they are going to expect, to try so that they can understand what it is that I'm trying to convey.
And I would just say that women have the advantage of being able to present different personas, I think, more easily than men. And hopefully we can also then learn from some classic political strategists like Sun Tzu, who says, when you're weak, show strength, and when you're strong, show weakness. So you can decide how you want to present yourself if you know how people are going to respond.
Thank you. A lot of this conference has entailed discussion about legislative office and women in those positions, but this panel, it has to do with the executive branch. Do you think there are any particular advantages to women who might be interested in politics in working their way up through state agencies or in positions in which they might end up in the executive branch rather than in the legislative branch?
Well, I can say I've been very fortunate. I've never worked in a legislative branch. I've really only had exposure and access to the executive branch. Sometimes I think that could be a weakness. I think that I should have probably tried at some point to work in Congress, because that would have helped me understand the legislative process a little bit more. Working for someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger is different because not only is he an executive, but he is the most famous person on the planet, probably. So when I am dealing with reporters, I'm not just dealing with local reporters, I'm not just dealing with state reporters, I'm not just dealing with national reporters, but we're dealing with international reporters, and I'm dealing with the entertainment press. Everything that we do is under enhanced scrutiny. At one time I was talking to an AP reporter, and they said that anytime they had Arnold Schwarzenegger in the lead of their story, they would get more play throughout the country with their stories. So everyone's trying to insert us in absolutely every single dialogue, issue, diatribe that there is, where normally you wouldn't have to worry about the issue because no one would ever call the governor's office to try and insert us into it. The positive of that is, again, the breadth of knowledge that I end up having and breadth of exposure that I end up having. It's fun when you get to be the executive because you get to set policy. It's frustrating when you aren't allowed to dictate it, say with the first iteration of the state bonds. The governor proposed what he wanted to do in terms of his package, but the legislature has the ability to thwart that, and that impacts his persona in terms of being an effective leader. So that's where the coalition building really ends up happening. But ultimately, it's where the rubber hits the road, and you're responsible for everything. I think if you're in a legislative branch, you can pick and choose those issues that are of interest to you. That's not a luxury that we have, but also it means that we can be involved in anything that the governor wants to be involved in.
And I'd say being in the executive branch is a great way to actually do policy because you are the implementer, the administrator, you're the carrier-outer of what the legislature decides that California needs to do. So if you have a particular policy interest, wow, is it fun to be able to see what works and what doesn't work sometimes. But also, I think just as much as local government is a good training ground for folks who want to get into elected politics, so is the executive branch of the government, because you can run an entity that is as large as any corporation, and you can deal with the bureaucracy and the PR nature of it, as well as the legislative nature. And also in the executive branch, you must, if you're going to be effective in your branch or in your agency, learn the budget process. Because if you don't, then you're going to be disadvantaged in the budget process, which for those of you who would be in the executive branch who would want to go into a legislative arena, you would know a very critical part of your job as a legislator from the standpoint of one of the key constituencies or stakeholders.
In a way, it's a little bit like the old book, What Color is Your Parachute? I would recommend that if you're thinking about political life, you really ought to take stock of what your own skills and interests are and try to find, especially if you're in your 20s or early 30s, try to find a set of opportunities in your life that will help you to develop on those interests. And so I actually taught at the college level, and then I had a chance to work in the private sector. That's where I learned about budgets, and that's where I learned about, human resources, progressive discipline, how to fire somebody, how to look for a good staff person. You can learn these things in a lot of different venues, but, I thought I was on a planning commission before I was on the city council, and I learned so much by getting my hands dirty, and, I wound up on the planning commission, and I got the sort of elected to city council, and there were a couple of jobs that city council members all belonged to other boards, and I got the jobs that nobody wanted. So I wound on the Solid Waste Authority of Alameda County, garbage, and on the Library Commission. Well, I wound up chairing the Library Commission, eventually fought to rebuild California school libraries because I knew what the problems were, and ran some of the most important bills to clean up old landfills and to stop. I wrote the bill to stop dumping white goods in landfills. I mean, there were things that I learned, even though it wasn't my main job at the time, or it was part of my career at the time, that carried me on in other venues. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, later these things will come back to you. I see Congresswoman Tauscher's joined us, and I happen to know she was a stockbroker, first woman on the stock exchange, and she learned a whole set of skills that make her a much more potent member of Congress. When she arrived, she hit the ground running, and in a financial sense. And I think that all of us need to be thinking about not not, this is a job I don't really like and I don't really want to do, but rather, what can I get out of this particular place that I am today? And how can I build and choose other assignments or volunteer positions, because you might be working in a nonprofit or being on the board somewhere, and that'll teach you some important skills that'll help you in political life later on.
Okay, well, we'll take a break then. Is that, yeah, okay, 5 minutes or so?